This episode of Historians of the Movies podcast is brought to you by our Patreon.com subscribers. If you'd like to help support the HATM mission, you can do so by going to patreon.com/historians at the movies. Now on with the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and every single week we are talking about movies and the histories behind them. And this week, we're talking about Monsters, Inc., and we've got an amazing guest for you. I'm talking about Surekha Davies. She just wrote this amazing book called Humans, A Monstrous History. What we have for you, the conversation we just recorded, is absolutely amazing, talking about a history of humanity through monsters, talking about why humans create monsters in their own minds, how monsters affect the ways in which we see the world around us, and of course, this amazing film and the stories that it has to tell us about the ways that we see the world. Monsters, Inc. is one of my favorite Pixar films. It's one of my absolute favorite movies, period. It's a movie that I absolutely love. I think a lot of you love it too. So this is a really fun and cool conversation with a really amazing person. So sit back and relax because Monsters, Inc. is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Surekha, we were just talking about it being dark where you are. We have a time difference. Are you 5 hours ahead? 7 hours?
I am 8 hours ahead of Colorado. So we're almost in a different day. So this is Paris time, and in a cold, dark, and wet, latitude. But we're gonna live in our imagination. So. Okay.
Can I tell you, this is becoming very common for me because I think out of the last 7 or 8 pods I have recorded, I think 5 or 6 of them have been with folks either in the UK or actually in Paris or now yourself in the Netherlands. I'm glad. And it's so much easier because when I've done these with people in Australia, it's almost exactly like 12 hours difference or something. So I I'm either staying up super late or they're staying up super late. This we can do. This is fine. So I am so excited to talk to you. You wrote a book.
I did. I can't believe it.
I have this book and I was showing you the inside, but I've all marked it up. The inside is entirely it's got so much highlighter in this book.
Oh, wonderful.
I love this thing when they send me the advanced
the special, yeah.
Oh yeah, these are like my special little thing. Oh, look at
so you know you're going to have to acquire some of the actual ones for your present drawer. So
you've got. Is that the hardback?
This is the hardback.
Ooh.
It's like a mirror broken on the back, and there's this hilarious font which you'll already recognize with the dolphins' tails and bat wings. Oh, you don't have that?
I see. My copy just has. It's just like, this is the one they send out, right?
Yeah, the ARC. So the real thing is thicker, it's bigger.
I'm looking forward to it. California will send me a copy. And if I'm going to meet Melvin,
I hope so. It's quite hilarious. It's really postmodern design. Yeah, I'm kind of peeping out of a monster mirror, which is the best. I had no idea they were going to.
Is this shades of the? Is it? Forgive me. Now I had him on top of my tongue. The guy in the mirror or in the painting who stays young.
Dorian Gray.
Dorian Gray.
Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yes.
Oh well.
He was one of my favorite stories.
I'll have to try and look younger than that picture forever.
Oh, man, let me tell you something. That every time I noticed the other day when I was getting ready for work and all that, and I realized there was now more gray in my beard than black, and I was like. This is what life is at 47. And I was like, oh my gosh, right? It's happening. Now it hasn't hit my hair. That is just leaving. It's just that is just falling out. But the rest of it, so I could go for some Dorian Gray right now is what I was saying. Like I see pictures of me when I used to work at Walt Disney World when I was 22 or 20 and 21. So much younger, man. So anyway, listen about me. I want to talk about you. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm Surekha Davies. I am a historian of science. I wrote my first book on European, cartographers, European map makers who tried to make sense of the peoples of the Americas. And, why did I end up on that topic? I watched way too much Star Trek as a child. And actually, my original undergraduate major was theoretical physics. And then I can realize when I took quantum mechanics that there wasn't going to be warp drive in my lifetime. And why would I want to be an astronaut? I won't even go camping. So, like half of my cohort, the ones who watch too much television, too much Jacques Cousteau, too much Star Trek, we swapped out to like other stuff. And I became a historian of exploration. And I guess, you might say that my second book as well, what we're going to talk about, Humans and Monstrous History, has also come out of that kind of deep mental architecture of Star Trek, of looking out of the world and wondering what the relationship between the world out there and the way in which we try and organize and understand it. And, our categories for things in the world, I don't know, cat, dog, killer whale, they have a relationship to the actual world we can touch and the actual, world we can predict. But at the same time, our senses are, they don't capture everything. And, categories are these stories about where one kind of thing ends and another begins.
Yeah, I find this fascinating as I read into your book. The name of the book, by the way, for everybody listening, it's Humans, A Monstrous History. I'll post links to this a little bit later on. For those of you listening, Surekha and I were just like showing our own copies of this to each other. So much of this, though, like as I was reading through your book, is really internal. The way we think about monsters and the way that we see monsters, right? Like, oh, I envision a monster or this, that, the other, things like that. But so much as I'm reading through your book, I come to realize like, oh, wait, these are actually internal processes talking about, hey, how do we see the world around us, categorizing the things, also the places that we go to. So much of this is like, hey, there's a monster. This is where it's from, right? This is why this is important and things like this, what it tells us and stuff. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this book, but also this movie, Monsters, Inc. today. But before we get into this, I have to ask you, what's your favorite monster?
My favorite monster in fiction, perhaps?
Either way, I could tell you about my former sister-in-law, but that's another story entirely.
Yeah. Well, since this is historians at the movies, yes. I'm talking about my favorite monster, fictional monsters. And, maybe one of them I'm going to hold off because we're going to talk about her a lot. And I think that is Boo in Monsters, Inc. So let's stick a pin there and say, she's actually my favorite monster of all time. So that's a big claim.
Boo is the monster. Oh, gosh, I hadn't even thought about that. Because if you look at... okay, that makes so much sense.
So we're going to talk about her a lot. So I'm going to back up a little bit and say, who is the also rans, who are kind of on the podium with her. And one of them has got to be Animal from the Muppet Show. I just love how nothing ruffles him. He is kind of cooler than anything. And, when you're a small child, and my earliest memories are of watching the Muppet Show and also vaguely wondering why the world wasn't like that. And I sort of gone through, life kind of permanently kind of pissed off that this isn't the Muppet Show. So I think, Animal is a favorite monster. And another favorite monster is Data from Star Trek, The Next Generation.
We're going to get into that.
And he is so, he's not a human being. He's merely an android. He knows that. He thinks humans are amazing, which is kind of charming when you look at what humans are like today. He's always trying to improve himself as someone who loves learning and is always trying to get better at stuff. That appeals. But he's so humble. He's he wants to be human, but actually today's human beings need to be more like Data.
Yeah, he's his innocence is, in my mind, the redeeming quality. By the way, the whole time you've been talking, I've been volunteering you for other episodes of this podcast.
Oh my God, this is so cool.
You have to come back on for Star Trek 4. I am aligning a who's who of people I want on this. I'm like, I need one other person.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah.
Yes.
We can talk. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Have you ever heard of the Rougarou before? Are you familiar with this monster? Here in the States, right? We have any version of Bigfoot, right?
Okay, right.
Right. In fact, I work closely with Comanche Nation, and some of the elders gave me a Comanche name, which is Pianape, which translates to Bigfoot. But I grew up in Louisiana, and there's like a take on Bigfoot down there called Rougarou, which is like this Bigfoot of the swamp, if you will. So
cool.
that
the
was
swamp
always
thing, the real swamp thing.
Yeah, very much so. That was always kind of my. But I'm also now stealing animal because of my love for Jim Henson and Disney and everything else. You can probably see the Disney stuff up back over my right shoulder here. So, all right. You came to me like, hey, I wrote this book about a monstrous history of humans. I'm like, sweet. What movie do you want to do? I'm like, there's no shortage of stuff. I'm thinking you're going to talk about Frankenstein or this, that, and the other. Of course, we will. And you said Monsters, Inc. And I said, absolutely. But why, Surekha? Why this film?
To me, it's, such a long answer. Maybe I need to write a book about that. But on one level, this is the movie that turns a mirror, like cue front of my book, turns a mirror on ourselves and shows us what we, whoever you want to say we is, we look like to those who we think of as being monstrous. So it's as if, instead of being Beowulf, we are Grendel, we are the monster. And what I love about it is that it's this most in-your-face, clear-cut fable about how monster making is a practice. Individual people and groups are not monsters, but stories are told saying they are. And, monster making is a way of telling stories about different kinds of living beings and defining what normal kind of means. And, I love the kind of emotional range of this movie. It goes from fear, to farce, and right from the moment it begins. And, this movie came out before, I enrolled, for a PhD, but I was already interested in, early European encounters in the Americas. But from the moment it begins with this incredible credits, this fantastic jazz soundtrack, which for a jazz head is amazing. The care of the drawings, the animation right from the credits, and it is that. And what I recognize now is that range from very silly and kind of too silly through to really scary is something that is in this book. And so I'm kind of cautiously hoping that readers will like it, even though it is, very unconventional in the range of things that are jostling together.
Well, I have read the book. People are going to love this book. Like I tell you, when I opened this book up, I got into it. I just started tearing through this. I read this book at work. People are like, what are you doing? It's like, reading about things. So one of the things that you say, though, Surekha, is that there are no monsters, but all of them are real. And I was like, oh, that line is juicy. Can you talk to me what you mean by that when you say that there are no monsters, but they're all real?
Yeah. So I guess the two parts, the no monsters part. Well, I guess monster is a word. It's a story about who or what is or isn't normal. So, people, observe the world and make decisions about what's normal and what isn't. And depending on where you cut the cake, anybody who, doesn't fit those, those mean little shapes, those little boxes, becomes a monster. So they don't really exist. But, because it's the value judgments, like beauty or, race, but they're real because they have real effects in the world. Once, people decide that there are individuals or groups who are threats or who don't deserve full rights, laws, social conventions spring up, around these stories. and have real effects in the world. For example, in the 17th century, in colonial Americas, there were these black codes that were written to separate poor white indentured servants in law from kidnapped and enslaved African enslaved people. And so, stories get written that then have long-lasting effects in the world. And that's what I mean by, there are no monsters. No one's actually a monster. But, all of these stories have real effects in the world because they are classificatory terms that have consequences, and that's why we need to pay attention to them.
How do you write a human history through monsters? Because one of the cool parts about this book is this book goes to a lot of different places and a lot of different time periods. How did you conceptualize how this book was going to be? Did it change over time as you started to think through it? Or, there's this adage amongst historians, it's like, look, we don't really know what we're writing until we're actually writing it. So how do you write this book? Like, how does this happen?
I suppose the structure didn't change a great deal, perhaps because I've been thinking about the categories of beings since I was about 7, watching Carl Sagan doing Cosmos. So I've been, drafting this book without knowing it for since forever. So the very first way I thought of it was, I called it Before Frankenstein. A history of European monsters before 1800, because that's kind of what I knew. I taught an upper level course on this, and students had loved thinking about monsters. I trained as a Europeanist, and that was kind of, it seemed like there wasn't a single author story of how Europe had thought about monsters before the Industrial Revolution. But as I started to develop the book for a general audience, I realized, well, why am I stopping at 1800 and then claiming, it really matters for the present? And I kind of reluctantly thought, I better look at what happens after 1800. And, it was kind of surprisingly okay to do that. And I guess at one point I thought, well, I'll kind of cover all of the world and try and get a reasonable geographical kind of distribution of monster types. And then I thought, well, actually that kind of book, it's very hard to have a genuine through line because places do their own thing on their own terms. And I had a very snarky / defensive line that didn't go in the book in the end. And it was, this is not a monster telephone book or wiki. I'm sorry if your favorite monster isn't here. And then I thought, well, no book ever has everything in it. And so I kind of pulled back to kind of focus on kind of Europe and the Americas with some examples elsewhere. Okay, so how did I choose all of this? I found myself wanting to give a real sense of the range of ways in which people have thought about where human ends and other stuff begins. And so giving that, range while still telling a story that flowed was quite important. So, for example, in the humans and animals story, I wanted to talk about the boundary between human and animal at the really big macro level, where do different species in prehistoric times end, and when does Homo sapiens begin, or how have people thought about the boundary between humans and apes? But then there's the micro as well. What about the microbiome? Are we simply giant, in Star Trek language, ugly bags of mostly water being controlled by the microbes in our bodies? And so I wanted to give that kind of range. And so while I kind of focused on, kind of Europe and the Americas, where I could give, a kind of counter narrative or expand the range of places where you could see people figuring out where human ended and something else began by, going elsewhere. I did that as well. But I guess most of all, if I thought that I had something to add with an example that might resonate with readers and help them to see monster making as a cultural process, then that was an example that was worth adding. Then it was, it's never going to be exhaustive short of it actually becoming a telephone book, which nobody wants to read.
I want to ask you, as we jump into this film here, actually ask you about the conceptions of monsters themselves. We've got two protagonists here, three if we count Boo, right? Who I love. Can I just say this out right now? Best ending in any Pixar film ever. The kitty line at the very end kills me every single time. I cry.
Oh my
Surekha,
God.
Boo looks so much like my like my sister at that age that
Wow.
I project. Every time. All right.
It's extraordinary.
Kills me.
Yeah. And if I can jump on that as well. I mean, the first time I watched the movie in the movie theater, I was kind of laughing the whole way, because the very first time I had no idea how it was going to end. And we're trying not to spoil that for people who haven't seen it yet. But I was kind of laughing the whole way through it, trying not to make noise because it's just such a funny movie. I went back a week later, expecting to have a great time. And I did. But right from the start, I was kind of silently sobbing because of the ending, which is lovely and bittersweet, but I wanted a different one. A different one.
Oh my gosh. First of all, I've got I've got something to say. If you haven't seen this film, stop what you're doing, go watch it. But also, more importantly, question your life's decisions. This movie is terrific. If you haven't seen Monsters, Inc. already, it's one of my favorites. It's one of my favorite Pixar films. Let's talk about Sully and Mike. We see our two protagonists here, John Goodman and Billy Crystal, perfectly cast. Yeah. We know immediately that these are the good guys, right? But my question is, when we think about monsters themselves, the first thing that pops in my mind is monster, right? Uh-huh. Are monsters inherently bad? Are conceptions of monsters inherently bad? How have people conceptualized what a monster is? Are there helper monsters? How do we think about monsters, or how have people thought about monsters over time?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how monsters, in the everyday today, at least in the West, have become this, fairly narrow category. Can mean like serial killers, and monster can mean, Frankenstein or the Minotaur or these made up monsters. And people don't, that word has become this very narrow in meaning. And one of the ways in which people today often see the kind of rationality of the present and project irrationality and superstition on the past or on other people is by saying things like, oh, well, back in the past, they believed in monsters, just like they believed the world was flat, which they didn't. And so not believing in monsters or using monster to mean imaginary stuff has become almost a stealth identity resonating thing today. But what the word monster can really means is, something that breaks the category of the thing it supposedly is. If you go to a monster truck rally, you're not going to see imaginary trucks. And yet there is that phrase, there you are. It means trucks that are extraordinary. They're huge. They've got, extraordinary bits sticking out of them. And someday I must go to a monster truck rally.
You have to wear the headphones when you go.
Oh, right.
Oh, they're so loud.
They're so loud. Yeah.
They're so loud. I have tinnitus in my ear already. And I'm like, oh my gosh.
I was just thinking about it.
Yes.
Right. So if monster is merely a category breaker, breaking the category doesn't have to mean that the thing breaking the category is dangerous. So it doesn't mean it's going to shoot lasers out of its eyes. There we go. That's something we'll come back to. The dehumanization of a monster. Often, that the pronoun of it is something that runs through Monsters Incorporated. But another way in which monsters are, framed as threatening is that they mess up the category of the person who's looking at them and seeing a monster. So your own category is under threat, and that's why you want to, if you can't abide the thought of a continuum from yourself to some other kind of person. You want there to be a break between, I don't know, men and women, or black and white, or Christian and Jew. And so, if a person needs there to be a boundary, or between, I don't know, a scientist and a historian, then anybody who falls in the middle creates a suggestion of there being a continuum. And it's when people don't want there to be any confusion about how they, I don't know, scientists are supposedly different from historian, and which is not to say that they're identical, of course they're not. That's when the people in the middle become disappeared and seen as threats. But Mike and Sully being good guys is an interesting phenomenon to me, because they're clearly monstrous in their own special ways. One is like big and furry and terrifying. The other one has only one eye and is mostly body, so is a caricature of a person in a different way. And of course, Boo meets them and just sees like fun folks to hang out with. As far as she's concerned, Sully, this giant blue terror, is a kitty, and yet to the monsters in Monsters Incorporated, she's terrifying. She's a threat. But as one goes through the movie, and we'll talk about that, no doubt, you can see that perspective shifting. And so, Boo is looking at Sully, and there's a moment when, it's like, I don't know, something out of kind of Vertigo, or the negative and the positive of the film flips and she sees something else. And there's also a kind of extraordinary moment when Sully, begins to realize that maybe Boo is not a monster. And I think the first moment is where, she's, they've taken her home to Mike's place, and she's drawing with crayons. Mm-hmm. And Sully's throwing hula hoops at her from a safe distance, which she's catching in her mouth like a seal. So it's kind of charming and yet dehumanizing, and that dissonance is very generative for like an adult watching this and thinking about what the parallels with real world. And that she's drawn a picture in crayon of Sully and herself, and she holds it up, and Sully kind of looks and it's like, whoa. And I'm thinking, oh, Sully's looking at her and thinking, my God, she makes art. She must be a human, She's like not, an animal anymore. And there are these kind of little moments where, the fact that she is, to Sully, this being from another dimension, like come through one of those doors, he begins to think, well, actually, maybe this child is not so threatening, is after all, even though she is a different kind of being. And there's a moment in the movie where he gives her a name and calls her she, and Mikey just flips out. Thinks, you went and named it? You know what comes next? And so, there's so much dialogue that could happen any day, every day, kind of all over the place. And that's a very striking and smart, because it makes us look at the dynamics in the real world.
Yeah, Pixar is doing this really sly thing that's teaching us the familiarization of the other, like the others, right? Yeah. It's like, it makes something real and personal and, safe. One of the things I really dug that you were doing, just because of my own research background and my work that I do, talking about indigenous peoples early on, and talking about how, origin stories and things like that. Can we talk a little bit about how monsters themselves have kind of helped people internalize their place in the world, how we get to where we are, and these questions about what we're supposed to be doing here and things like that?
Sure. I think there are, a striking number of kind of origin stories that have at their core some beings that are, more ancient than people, more powerful than people, people as like the junior members. And I think, there are kind of indigenous, American cosmologies where, people came along, kind of later and had to be taught, how to behave in the world and how to be responsible. And that kind of thinking is kind of different from, the Christian tradition of, the earth having been created for humanity, who was made in God's image to rule over. And, those two ways of thinking about humanity's place in the universe permit and expect of people quite different things. I mean, one is of stewardship and humility. We are not the only beings with, with inner lives, whose, experience and existence matter. So if you think about, humanity's place on the planet as one of, a mutual relationship, then it's, becomes much more, important to not be in a completely extractive relationship where the conditions of, plants, the soil, other animals, other peoples don't matter. And of course, the big arc of Monsters Incorporated is that we are following the workers in an energy factory.
Mm-hmm.
And what the company does is create energy for the city of Monstropolis. And where does this energy come from? Well, it's actually the screaming of children who scream when they meet a monster. So in the middle of the night, for a child, the monsters will go through the portals, their closet doors, and frighten them. And then there are these big canisters that gather their screams. And at the start of the movie, we learn that as far as the monsters are concerned, human children are dangerous, they're toxic. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that a child could, follow a monster back through a door into Monstropolis. Mm-hmm. And this is, of course, what happens pretty early on in the movie. And it, at this point, the movie becomes a disaster movie with people running, screaming from the so-called monster. But that extractive relationship depended on those monsters seeing the human children, simply as these threats. And that relationship you could call that an ecological relationship across the portal of the door. And of course, that we aren't sealed off from other animals or from the environment. Our skins are porous. Our bodies are changed by what we eat, what we absorb. We cannot be separated from our microbiomes. So, going on living on Mars is like the stupidest idea, imaginable, because that's, we're not going to have, the kind of microbiome diversity that is kind of needed. This is not even about kind of generations, and it is really the opposite of a kind of an indigenous kind of approach of kind of stewardship and recognizing other beings. It's extractive. Let's extract from this planet and go somewhere else rather than solving anything that's here.
Well, I want to ask you, because there was a name that pops up in your book that I was not expecting to see, that I loved seeing, and that is Ulysses Aldrovandi. And I'm going to show. Now it's time for me to play show and tell with you. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Talking about the porous nature of human skin. This...
It's a turtle.
It's a turtle by Ulysses Aldrovandi from 1645.
No way.
Yes. So before we started recording, I was telling you how much I love the ocean, how much I love Florida. So I did my doctoral work at the University of Minnesota, and we have Aldrovandi's books at the Wagenstein Historical Library. It's a library of science and things like that, right where you'd expect to see. And the curator, my friend Emily, saw this. She's like, Jason, you have to see. She knows I love turtles. I was like, I need this, and I need this on me forever. So I tell the story very often about how, in this time era, this era of exploration, of conquest, of colonialization, these European empires were not just sending out conquistadors and, religious personnel but they're also sending out naturalists and things like that to categorize the world around them. And of course, that's how this ends up in Aldrovandis' book. It's how it ends up on my right forearm many years later. And I'm thinking about this in terms of the movie, because our two good guys, right, are bipedal. They're, even though they're hairy and monocled, or cycloptic. Is that a word?
It is now.
It is. We're going to go with it, right? Our villain, Randall, is the least human, right? He's not bipedal. He's lizardy, snaky, something. I don't know. Can we talk about that? About like the linkages, because you talk about the linkages between humans and animals as we monstrify the world around us.
I'm struck by how Randall, the arch villain, is. He's reptilian, in his kind of movements. You can see this kind of scaliness. Even for a reptile, he's alarming. He has about 8 feet. He has 8 limbs. I was counting today, and he moves fast, and I think you'd have to like really pause the video to count them, but there are 8. And he can also go invisible. And so
a little bit.
So many ways in which he is kind of uncanny. And but I think which animals are uncanny, they're not. I'm not sure they're kind of universal. Which ones kind of resonate as being most uncanny. Animals that are lucky or unlucky. They're not especially universal. I mean, that's a whole book that was there to be written, which is like the monstrous animals book. But certainly in the Western tradition, there have there was in the Middle Ages this anxiety that this human superiority was not necessarily a given for all time for all individuals, and if you behave badly enough, you could kind of slip backwards and overlap with like the least worst of the ape types, and the kind of apes were the kind of poor relations. They were like the simulacra that weren't quite kind of good enough. And there's kind of embedded in kind of European languages are these phrases like to ape someone is to like imitate them badly, and we talk about aping to mean kind of failing. What you see in some of the kind of scientific treatises is people trying to analyze comparatively different kinds of bodies to see what they have in common, what they don't. Of course, Aldrovandis Natural History Project was one of like gathering as many things as possible and kind of trying to catalog them. And some of these volumes of drawings of the beings in the world are striking in that they're notionally, say birds and animals and things that aren't humans, but humans who were unusual got drawn and put in there. So it's kind of very subtle conversation about, well, anywhere I'm going to talk about animals, I'm also going to talk about humans who are kind of strange enough that they have somehow kind of broken that category, so they get to be placed here. And in terms of kind of where monsters fit in the picture, I think maybe Darwin's Origin of Species is a kind of fun example in that the very idea of the random mutations that happen all the time, and then shifts in the environment end up making some of those random mutations advantageous, and then a species gradually changes. And so under, an ecological distress, monsters become the ones that kind of quote unquote win. And so you could say that evolution is really the march of the monsters. And today, as I was saying kind of earlier, we talk like monsters are either fictional or they're sociopaths. But biology just has different words for monster. They'll talk about there being a new discovery. And what new discovery also means is we don't actually have a species for this. So we're now going to call it something. So it's much more kind of classifications become, so open, the rhetoric of biological classification, that people have already left room for the monsters, so they don't even need to be called that. They're just going to get, a name and a place, which is a much less monstrifying, way to do science.
I want to ask you, the other things we see, one of the big things aspects of Mike and Sully's life is, they're very much like us, right? They are monster men who are in monster relationships with other monster women. And we see monster sex and gender identity presented on a very binary scale in this film, right? I think part of that's due to the nature of the times. I don't know that would be the case if they made this film in 2025. But I'm wondering how seeing sex and gender through monsters, because you talk about how women have been monstrified in the book. I'm thinking specifically about the witches in American history and things like that. How does seeing human history through monsters help us understand, say, sex and gender?
I think, some of the language about how individuals and groups are threats carries through from, to between, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and people who are seen to be kind of atypically embodied in not fitting male-female binary behaviors or embodiments. And so, we can see this kind of language of individuals being a threat, carrying across. And so one of the things I try to kind of do with the book is to kind of show those patterns of stories being written about where does abnormal begin, right? How hairy does a woman have to be before they become, like the, what were they called sometimes? It's like the bearded lady who suddenly, is such an object of fascination that's actually how they are either coerced to make their living or forced to make their living. And I think as one, looks at kind of European colonists and clerics in, say, the colonial Americas, what you see in the kind of archives is what's kind of a much kind of wider, range of genders and gender fluidity being demonized by kind of Christian authorities. So what, the kind of range of genders and forms of gender expression have, over time and space, they've kind of varied. And, whether or not people have seen individual groups as threats has not remained constant. And indeed, the kind of early Christian, church fathers, there were some who thought that, well, maybe the original human, Adam before Eve, was androgynous. I mean, that's an idea that scholars call primal androgynous. The first being was neither male or female or both. And so, even, within Christianity, that, question of, well, how many genders are quote unquote normal was not fixed in those early centuries.
The other thing that pops into my mind here is you're telling me this is the idea that, like, you talked earlier on about viewpoint, right? The idea that Boo is the monster very early on. I went, why didn't I see that, right? And at the same time, right, I'm thinking that what this tells me is that this viewpoint of who is and who is not a monster comes from a very male, often a very dominant patriarchal kind of a male kind of gaze at the rest of the world. Certainly women have also been looking at the world and classifying as monsters and non-monsters and things like that. But it feels to me, Surekha, that a lot of this is coming from power dynamics about who and what is and belongs in, say, human society. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, whether, I guess at every scale, whether it's a state-wide scale or the scale of like your little kindergarten, whoever is a mover and shaker, is kind of telling stories and enacting, and saying, who is or isn't a monster, or who is or isn't normal enough. Are you girly enough for the kindergarten playground?
Right.
And to takes back to the movie. There are a number of very standard, you could say old-fashioned characters in Monsters Incorporated, but the movie is also, it's going for something retro. I mean, I remember like seeing it in whatever it was, 2001, and it felt like charming and retro because it was, it was resonating with older movies. And actually for me, the kind of Boo was, so there are some old-fashioned gender roles, Ocean's 8, it ain't. But right from the start for me, Boo was absolutely extraordinary because she's tiny, she's fearless, and she's more powerful than all of the adults. And this for me was just absolutely eye-opening. I mean, she became my role model. I mean, she was 2. She couldn't talk yet.
Didn't even think about her in these matters, and it's now completely making me rethink this film.
And she's a girl, and she's not. I know I'm not one to talk, but she's like, oh, she's just a straightforward girl. She's not non-binary. You could say she's a tomboy, but she's also 2. I mean, they're all like running around like terrors at that point.
Right.
But she wears pink. And yet she's terrifying. And once I saw her, I became able to wear pink. I have a pink phone. Oh, wait. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So I have a pink phone. I was going to wear something pink, and then it was like so cold I couldn't change face changing into something pink in honor of her. Had I thought of it this morning, I would already have put pink stuff on. But she, so she's multidimensional. She's not cookie cutter. It's kind of, I love the both andness of her. She can be wearing pink and like her teddy bear and still be the most hardened 2-year-old, because the scariest monster in the factory, his assignment is to scare her. Mm-hmm. And, by the end, the tables have turned.
I want to ask you about what we don't see in this film. Something you hinted at early on, certainly in the book, you talked towards the end of the book about, right? All of our monsters in this film, Boo included, are organic. They're made of some form of flesh and blood. But as you really kind of point out and flesh out in the book, how do we conceptualize inorganics, like robots, Terminator, cyborgs, Data, all of these other things, AI, which now, if you're a professor, is like its own form of monstrosity. It feels like at times when I talk to my friends in the field, as well as like extraterrestrials.
Mm-hmm.
How do we conceptualize them? Like, how do we understand? Are robots monsters?
I guess I could ask the question of myself this way, like, why do I have a chapter on machines in my book? As I do. Mm-hmm. Machine is a machine. A machine isn't a monster. And I suppose, the book is a monstrous history of humans. So, it's about anxieties about where human ends and something else begins. And on the one hand, something like a vacuum cleaner, well, it's not a person, you build it with parts, I'm a person, I'm organic, that, machine over there is not. But, in fiction, in philosophy, I mean, people have used the foil of the robot to, as an allegory for the mm-hmm. human condition. And so in that word robot entered kind of Western European languages, from this kind of Czech, playwright used this word robota, which I know temporarily kind of forgotten whether I think it means enslaved person. I think, kind of hastily like, open my book, she says very, very loudly. But what I mean in this kind of play from the 1920s. These kind of robots kind of like decide that they want a better life. Actually, it's a Czech word for person forced to perform labor. In another word, phrase enslaved. robot.
That makes so much sense to me, Surekha, because of the idea that the fear behind, say, robots, when we see like in the Terminator films or something like that, is what happens? Well, they gain their own autonomy, right? They become self-aware, and then they stop taking orders. And then what happens? They declare war on all mankind, which is, oh my gosh, the very fears that happened that were carried by slaveholders of human beings who were afraid in the Caribbean or the Americas or elsewhere that these people would exercise their own autonomy, and in doing so, declare war on the slaveholders and their families and burn down the slaves and slave farms and plantations and things like that. So, my gosh, does that make sense?
So, and of course, we're looking at, in the 1920s, this is also the time of kind of labor revolts in Europe.
Yeah.
And, this obscure play was, quickly translated into, multiple languages. So kind of even these, hunks of metal have been, ways to think about what it means to be human and who gets to be human. And then when you move from kind of the hunks of metal to kind of to, beings who are more similar to people, it gets, more and more interesting. So there's Data in Star Trek, who is, what they call an android. It's a fairly convincing robot who looks like a human being, but not entirely. For example, he can't use contractions. He will say is not rather than isn't. And I have to say, having, originally been an academic and now writing for a general audience, every time I correct my is not sentences to isn't, I feel like I'm like going, it's like one of those moments like, oh God, like Data is now having to try and do this thing that doesn't come naturally. But he, he doesn't destabilize the category of the human because, he tries to learn. There are things he's so good at that makes him inhuman. He learns to tap dance in about 5 minutes, and he does it in a very strange way. He's terrible at playing a musical instrument in a way that can, create emotion in a flesh and blood person. And then it turns out that, he has an evil twin brother who was created before him. And, this twin, Lore, is actually much better at simulating a regular human being. And because he's so much closer to us, that makes him uncanny. He's scary because he really does start to blur the boundary between beings who are built and beings who are born. And, Lore will just say isn't. Lore will use slang, and Data, amazingly, can learn 710 languages, but he cannot, say isn't. And then you move from androids to like one step even closer, and that's like cyborgs. I'm going to stay with Star Trek, which is also code for anyone who hasn't watched Star Trek DS9 or Star Trek Next Generation. Start now.
Can I tell you quickly? I have I grew up as a Star Wars guy, Surekha, and I've been venturing farther and farther into Star Trek. I'm still Star Wars at heart, but I see these guys make these custom starships, and I want one. I'm an Excelsior guy. That's my ship. Sorry, it's just that's my team. I'm Team Excelsior. All right, go ahead. Sorry, felt like I had to out myself as an Excelsior man. So
no, it's Star Wars is curious because it's simultaneously science fiction, it's in the future, and fantasy, it's in the Middle Ages.
Brilliant,
So it
brilliant stuff that Lucas did. Yeah.
Anyway, so cyborgs and the Borg in the Next Generation are amazing. They are the ultimate villain. So they are half organic, half machine, and they are sort of a composite species that trolls the galaxy in these cubic ships that give off this green light. So it's like everything about them is quote unquote wrong. Oh my God, the ships are cubes. Oh no, it's like green light coming out. All these kind of codes for the things that are wrong. And they whiz around the galaxy and look for species who have some kind of distinctiveness that the Borg doesn't already have, and then they go and assimilate them. So they just kind of turn up, and then they stick their cyborg parts into every single person they can get their hands on, and then that person will, suddenly also go like, they will lose their, color and go pale, and they will have, microscopic critters inserted into them. Nanites, I think they're called now. No, they're not. They're called something else. I haven't watched an episode in a little while. But anyway, people become part machine and part organic, and then they become, part of this, genocidal apparatus that goes from planet to planet, swallowing people. And they do disrupt the distinctiveness of the organic individual and make us ask whether, in the search of efficiency, whether there's a point at which, inhumanity begins, because, that's the Borg's argument. They're seeking perfection. Why would you not want to be perfect? Why would you not want to be part of this, better technology? And what's lost here is free will. And I feel like every year there's a different lesson to be learned from the Borg. But, consent is not required. As they say, resistance is futile. And I think we're seeing that now with tech companies looking to steal human intellectual property. So they've already collected data, without consent. And even from social media, which you could say, well, it's free, what did you expect? The thing is, they replaced a lot of other forms of communication with advertising apparatus. So we've lost media and had it replaced by modes of data colonialism, as, to use a phrase of a recent book. So, I feel as if what we're living in today is the worst dystopia, a worse dystopia than the things in the movies, apart from the things in the movies actually having pantomime villains that look scary, like the Borg. But to, move to a kind of less kind of pessimistic example, I guess, kind of aliens also, are a kind of being, against which, people have thought about what it means to be human. I mean, often in the imaginative sphere, and so where the movie E.T. is, phenomenal, because this very, very kind of cartoon-like alien comes down, to Earth, and ends up in this, I don't know, I guess you call it parasympathetic relationship with a young boy. And I heard Steven Spielberg being interviewed about this once, and he said, maybe one of the reasons this movie was so powerful and still resonates is that you have these two beings who are so different, who manage to connect, and compared to the difference between E.T. and all of the kids in that movie, how different are people on Earth?
I felt like what's at stake here is the idea of humanity, right? The Borg have certainly lost their humanity, or they're stealing the humanity from the people that they enslave into their system. And the characteristic, when you brought up E.T., the first thing that popped in my mind, Surekha, is his glowing heart, right? The thing that makes him so sympathetic is quite literally his giant heart. This idea about what it means to be human is to feel and to emote and to be connected to one another. And I guess that's what makes them such sympathetic. These are sympathetic people that you go with. I guess maybe that's part of the reason why, I felt when I watched Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you don't feel afraid. You feel this idea of being tied to these other people as well.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you, we talked about our mutual love of Boo. Are there parts of this film when you go back and rewatch this film or think about your experiences with this film, maybe your associations with it, what really resonates with you on a level as a scholar, as a person? And we talk about taking humanity from things. We could always talk about academia, but what parts of this movie really speak to you?
I guess it kind of resonates in different ways, different bits, because the emotional kind of range that the movie, kind of generate is so great. I mean, some bits of it are just hilarious because Monstropolis looks like New York City, and so there's a resonance in terms of there's a kind of joy, and it also you feel as if we are the butt of the jokes because we're watching this place of monsters, and it's just like where we are, and they're really mundane, and they're sweet, and they just have real lives. And then you realize, oh yeah, well, think of all the wars on Earth that are so often based around demonizing, monstrifying language, because that's how you justify killing people. And that you have propaganda lines in Monsters Incorporated that are they're very saccharine, and they're understated, and maybe I'm reading stuff that they actually didn't even know they were putting in, but a phrase like we scare because we care. That is the logo of the energy company, and it's it takes what they're actually doing, which is extracting energy from these children by kind of frightening them, and turns them into heroes. So that's quite striking. There are moments when, and I was kind of saying before, when Sully and Boo suddenly look at each other and see one another kind of differently. And maybe the kind of most upsetting one there is when Boo suddenly, looks at Sully, who is in a situation he didn't even want to be in, and sees a terrifying monster. And she's so scared. And I think any moment anything terrible happens in life, in my life, not terribly terrible, but I there are these moments when you thought you knew someone, or you thought you knew your institution, or you thought you knew X, and then it's not. And I'm reminded, oh yeah, remember when she, and it's like this loss of innocence, and like this fear that there's no going back. And then Sully then grieves for a while, and he's wondering, am I the asshole? Am I the monster? I'm the monster. And I guess, we have those moments as well when we think we offended someone and we didn't mean to, and should we have known better? And is this because we're actually horrible? That kind of resonates. But also, just to kind of, I think the kind of happiest resonance really is that she's such a hardened toddler with no shoes, just wants to stop, and the scariest person in the movie. And I think that got me through grad school, because I was supposedly not good enough to get funding. So, I had a half-time job. I'd become a curator at the British Library because nobody would fund my cockamamie projects. I tried to kind of look for a way to, do it anyway. And then I went half-time, hoping I would get funded partway through because they could see I could do it. No, they didn't. And I think, her, Boo's irrepressibility, because, of course, the Monsters, Inc. movie, came out, a little while before I started grad school. I think she went in on top of Carl Sagan and Star Trek, and I think she got underneath them, and probably, I'm actually a puppet, being moved by all of their ghosts.
I love it. I actually love also the line, the idea. It's like, wait a second, we're talking about monsters and all of this, and what may be the most terrifying aspect of all might just be self-reflection. I want to ask you, you've got 2 books now. You just wrote this one. What are the books that have really influenced your own work? The stuff that, Surekha, that has spoken to you on your journey, either in creating this most recent work or the other things? Like, what are the books we should be reading aside from Humans and Monsters History? Aside from this one.
Wow. Well, I think a couple of books that were formative very early on for me, early grad school, and then a couple that were really formative as I was finishing this book. So at the start, as an undergrad, I read this book called The Great Cat Massacre. and other episodes.
Know this book. Oh, yes. Oh, this is, yeah.
It's
yes.
kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And, and it's a book of it's a book of essays about, French history in the 18th century. And it opens with this great cat massacre. It's this moment when a bunch of apprentices, murder the factory owner's cat. And it's been years since I've read it. I should reread it. And basically, all of these apprentices think it's hilarious that, that cats were getting murdered, something like that. And what Robert Bainton says is, here is something that is deeply strange in the historical archive. That's a clue that there's something here we don't understand. And so instead of looking at things that make no sense and deciding, whoa, people in the past had no brains, or they were superstitious, to think, right, there's something I don't understand here. People in the past were also rational. They also had brains. We have agendas just as they did. So when you see something that, where you can't see what the rationale is, that's a sign to kind of go in. There's something that you're not understanding on their own terms. And I guess that's why when I, began working on my first project, and I was interested in how Europeans wrote about and created illustrations of peoples of the Americas. And my dissertation advisor said, well, that's too broad. You work at a map library. Why don't you work on images on maps? And I was thinking, well, I'm going to say yes just to please them, but I don't want to be typecast as a map person. So I'm actually secretly going to do everything. And in a way, we were both right. And it was by looking at stuff that was outside maps that I had something interesting to say about the images on the maps. But, the whole map world was telling me, oh, there's no topic there. Oh, pictures on maps were just decorations. Oh, they were just decorations. Oh, they were made up. And I thought, has anybody checked? And I think that was Bob Danton's message. Like, don't assume people were making stuff up or didn't have brains. And another book that was really important at that time was written by Katie Park and Lorraine Daston, called Wonders and the Order of Nature. And it's a history of that emotion of feeling wonder and how that shaped science between about 1150 and 1750. So from the Middle Ages up to just before the French Revolution. And they talk about emotion as being something that shapes shapes cognition, shapes how we think, how we evaluate what we apprehend through our senses. And they have a chapter on monsters, which pleases me, but also strange objects. And so what Daston and Park did is they normalized the study of the strange in the history of science. And then kind of more recently, I think probably the 6-8 months before my book went into production and the options started narrowing down, a kind of wonderful editor suggested to me that I read Ed Yong's An Immense World. And it's a book about animal senses. And I had read other work by Ed Yong, and he wrote a book about the microbiome, for example. And so I picked up the senses, and I kind of realized why. It was because it was such a great model for how to write about a topic that was, in theory, enormous, the senses of all the animals. Well, how many animals are there? 11 million. You can't write about them all. And I realized, every chapter contained a small number of animals. And I was never thinking, well, what about the ones that are not here? I was too busy enjoying, what he'd written about the animals that were there. And some of the examples were several pages long. And sometimes there'd be a paragraph or two where he'd take you through a dozen examples, one after another, maybe one sentence per animal. Imagine. But then every sentence was so beautifully, connected to the next one. It was like a slow motion Olympic relay race. So you might have an elephant reaching out, a trunk and grasping a dolphin's flipper because he'd written it so that the segue was beautiful, and then the dolphin would wave its tail and connect to another animal. So in terms of seeing how he could tell a story with a lot of characters and make it smooth, I mean, I guess that was, that book was a great inspiration. And I think finally, was kind of amazing book, doing it as a finishing mine, was Naomi Klein's Doppelganger. It's kind of history. It's a history of the present, of the last, especially the last 5 years, the weird COVID years. It's a memoir of how she found that people were confusing her, Naomi Klein, with Naomi Wolf. Yeah.
Yeah. Bummer.
Yeah, and what it feels like to have your identity destabilized. And of course, that idea of the doppelganger and the uncanniness is, of course, there's some of that feeling in the idea of the monster, that the self is destabilized. And I was very, her writing is amazing. And again, the movie, she moves so elegantly between maybe a literary example and the present and some element of memoir. And again, she's just a master storyteller. And I'd loved to have had another 6 months to work on my book. So 2 months to be on vacation and another 4 months fully rested to make it better. But, we don't usually get that kind of luxury.
I'm going to have to read Doppelganger now. I get so many people say, Jason, you remind me so much of Brad Pitt and Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Obviously, it happened. So, no.
You wish.
I get Ricky Gervais, and I'm like, no, don't say that.
Okay, I was going to say I can see that, but I'm not going to say that.
Don't say that. I'm going to be sad. All respect to Ricky. I'm sure he's a lovely human. All right, Surekha, our final question here. Is Monsters, Inc. a history movie?
Oh, wow. Well, it depends on how we define history, right?
Oh, doesn't it though?
So I'm not going to define it in an unimaginative, boring way, which is to say, well, these things didn't happen because there are no monsters and there are no doors, so we're going to rule that literal, reading out. So then, is it history in a different way? Do we, is it an allegory? Are there going to patterns of that story arc or patterns in those relationships that are real? And this is where I'd say, yes. For example, that extraction of energy, that extractive empire thing does make me, think about, colonialism, but also the energy crisis. And I remember, watching this when it came out in the movie, and I was already nervous about energy. I think in the very late 90s, kind of almost like as I became an adult with agency, I, made choices about flying less. There were opportunities would come up, and, I was flying less than, my peers, because that had become a thing. And it's striking now to remember myself being worried about energy and climate, 20 whatever years ago, and in a weird way, it's sort of prophetic in that way. One of the arcs is of this factory owner, who's a third generation factory owner. It seems like such a good guy, Mr. Waternoose, even though he's played by James Coburn, which really should have been a clue.
Oh, that growly voice. He's so good, though.
And
big spider.
Sidebar. This is another thing that's amazing about Monsters, Inc., and it's the cast. And so for an adult, you're watching Mike, but you're thinking Billy Crystal. Randall, the really scary monster, is Steve Buscemi. And, if you've seen Fargo or Con Air, it's terrifying. And I haven't even watched Reservoir Dogs, which I think is like the ultimate thing. I don't even know if he's a good guy in that. But so there are these kind of terrifying, characters. But, Mr. Waternoose, the factory owner, he wants to keep his factory going. And there's this line where he's captured on tape saying, I'll kidnap 1,000 children before I let the company die. And you start thinking, gosh, when do the ends justify the means? And the tragedy is that it turns out that, this is a bit of a spoiler, laughter is more powerful than scream energy. So there was no need to create all of this fear. And there was a different way to get energy that,
Tell me there are alternative energy sources out there?
Yeah, and just think of that. In 2001, I mean, this is a message in a children's movie. And so, this is sort of, not new. And what I hope, is we need to make that monster-topia happen. We need to see each, person as a person and an individual, and not to feel threatened by other people being different, or the fact that they might encourage more other people to be different, or changing ourselves.
Now, all I can think, you mentioned cast, all I can think about is the great John Ratzenberger, Abominable Snowman. How about Adorable Snowman?
Well, yeah, actually, that's a good line, because the Abominable Snowman is actually the most kind of cringeworthy character for me in the movie, and I kind of rewatched it today, and I was always dreading the bit with the Abominable Snowman, because and then I realized he only has about 5 minutes airtime, and yet in my mind, the final quarter of the movie, is kind of marred by him. And I guess I'm kind of being a little unkind, because this is a caper movie, it's a farce, it's a comedy, it's screwball comedy. This is how it is, but it kind of also trivializes the monster, and I guess, if something is trivial, you don't pay attention to it. And that is, those are the stories that actually are sometimes kind of foundational, but by pretending they don't matter, then people don't address them.
Right. Well, I hope that as people, I expect that a lot of people are going to come to this pod who know this film already, and it's like, oh, I love that movie, let me go listen to it. But I hope now, in listening to you talk about this film and also talk about this amazing book that you wrote, we'll go back and watch this film with a new eye, because I think that this is, looking back, this is a phenomenal film, but it is a real sharp look at the way that humans engage with one another. And
absolutely.
Sitting here talking to you, Surekha, has been an absolute blast. I know it's nighttime where you are. It's cold and dark. It'll be cold and dark here like 3 hours here in Colorado. So I can't thank you enough for coming on today. This was just an absolute blast. Thank you so much.
So much fun. Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
And that's a wrap here at Historians at the Movies podcast. Thank you so very much to our guest, Surekha Davies. Thank you so much for being here, Surekha. Guys, if you want to check out her book, you can do so now. It's available anywhere that books are being sold. It's called Humans, A Monstrous History. It's really just a page turner. I absolutely loved it. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And thank you to all of you for continuing to be here and support what we're doing here. Again, if you want to help support the mission, you can do so by going to patreon.com/historiansofthemovies, or you can shoot us an email at hatmpodcast@gmail.com if you're interested in sponsoring the show. So we got a whole lot more pods coming to you. We've recorded a bunch, got even more coming your way soon. So keep listening, keep sharing, and we will see you next time. Ciao for now.